right brain. Um, and so it is a good metaphor. Um,
So do you? Well, I'm recording. What do you think that those are metaphors, or do you think those are really brain structures? Because it seems to me when people do intuitive work, they're working whole brain. So I'm interested in what you think.
yeah. Well, first of all, I think science is metaphor, um, and but it's in the sense that metaphor means to bridge across, literally. So for the left brain, there is no such thing as metaphor, except metaphor as a word.
Mm.
But for the right brain, everything is metaphor.
Interesting.
And the only way the right brain can truly learn to understand its metaphors is through the left brain. And unfortunately, the left brain basically co-opts things that are metaphors and makes them either into facts which don't really exist. So, for example, it may not be there today, but when I was in medical school and the text for pharmacology, which is still, I'm sure, being updated and used, Goodman and Gilman, in the introduction, it says, ultimately, we do not know how any drug works. Now, of course, that was in the 70s, but we'd been using antibiotics for 40 years at that point, or 50 years. We'd been using many other drugs. We had some basic drugs for epilepsy, hypertension, many things. And we don't. So we know that the way a drug works is statistical. If there's a probability, and the hypothesis for how it works has validity if the probability of getting the desired outcome is significant enough to say this is a good thing to do. But it still doesn't mean we know how a drug works, and we don't know how evolution works. I mean, we know that there is. So I'm giving you examples. Evolution is a metaphor. We know that there is Darwin's discovery of selection, natural selection, explains aspects of it, but it doesn't explain how many mutations it would take to take a four-legged animal that lives on the land and create the front legs into wings. Suppose it was 100 mutations, and every one of them would have to be viable in such a way that that organism that's transitioning through these mutations is never disadvantaged for survival. So clearly, the fact that the way that we look at family trees or the origins of species are gigantic, we don't know. So evolution is a word that nobody truly understands, but it's useful. The Big Bang is a metaphor. Nobody truly understands that. And then if we understand that science uses metaphors, and then pretends that it knows what it is, just like spiritual people use metaphors like God and then pretend that they know what that is. And to me, it's beautiful when you understand that if you're talking about the autonomic nervous system, we do have a deep understanding of how that works. But if you want to sell yoga to the Veterans Administration, you don't say, here, yoga, which comes from India and it's a form of meditation. You say, no, this will downregulate the sympathetic nervous system, upregulate the parasympathetic nervous system. And as soon as you say that, you've got these scientific metaphors and everybody goes, oh, yes, okay, that means it's valid. The fact is, yoga was always valid. Yoga did all the things yoga does now. But we just explained it in different metaphors. We explained it with chakra systems. We explained it with Ayurvedic medicine, for example. And we explained it with Eastern medicine and energy system medicine. And so everybody, they're all different metaphors to me. And that means I don't get too attached to deriving my identity from what I know ultimately is a metaphor. But what I do understand is that if we have an imbalance of the sympathetic nervous system, we're going to have hypertension, agitation, stress, profuse sweating. Not going to be able to sleep. We're going to lose weight. We're going to be in trouble. And if we have an over balance in the left brain, we're going to be rational, but without the ability to let the rationality start from something actually fundamental or essential. So you can start from hatred. You can start from prejudice. You can start from completely, things that aren't true, that are just conjecture or belief, and then rationalize. But all the rationalization stands on a foundation that has no basis many times, unless the left brain communicates back to the right brain, which happens primarily through poetry, music.
What about meditation?
Meditation, deep contemplation, those processes. Then we end up in a society that's getting more and more isolated in arguments that are rational, but they have no fundamental meaning because they start from the irrational, or they start from the non-rational. In the 70s, so that's why I say metaphor.
So how does one get to the truth?
That's a really good question. I think that statistics gives us a relative truth, and that, medicine is based on statistics, Western medicine, and so is science to some extent. But if you're talking about truth in an absolute sense, then again, we're talking about a metaphor that can't ground in something objective and concrete. Truth is not ultimately objective and concrete. It has to be an affair of the heart. It has to be a deep, heartfelt, bodily recognition that this is true, meaning I don't want to kill you, I don't want to harm you. Unless my life is in danger, I have no desire to do anything harmful to you. Fairness, integrity. What's the truth of love? What's the truth of faith, or what's the truth of forgiveness and trust? And they are themselves kind of virtues. They are themselves truths of their own. But if we think we're going to get to the truth rationally, no, we're going to get to a derivative.
Maybe one way to approach it is to look at repeated patterns that all religions say: be kind to your neighbor, what you do has consequences, there's an afterlife, there's a higher spirit. So maybe that's one way of getting at truth.
Yeah, I would say truth is what's there as you slowly digest the stories that you derive your identity from. And then you discover that by letting go of your identity as a Democrat, you aren't annihilated. Is letting go of your nationalistic identity, let's say as an American, you're not annihilated. That there's something deeper. There's a deeper ground, a shared heart. There's some place that is deeper, but you have to work very hard to peel away the levels that give us the false sense of security derived from, let's say, the stories we tell ourselves that become the basis of our beliefs, what we rest on.
The stories are, would you say this is true, are originally created by children as protection and a way of coping? So they have truth in as far as it's protective for the child?
Well, again, there you're talking about relative truth, yes. The ultimate purpose of meditation is to come to no story. What do we rest on? We rest on a ground of being that isn't a story. It's a direct experience. It's an irrefutable experience of being at one with an inseparable from. So the perceiver and the perception are the same thing. The experience and the experience are the same. Inner and outer are the same thing. Above and below, not the same thing, but a single one. And so, if you meditate and you're sitting there, you're not an American. You know that that's a functional identity. It would be like me saying that I'm a teacher when I'm not in the role of being a teacher, and then having to defend that identity, or borrowing my identity from wealth, and then throwing a temper tantrum if my service at the restaurant isn't, up to my you know, how I identify myself because of my wealth or because of my um, elitist values or whatever you want. I mean, everybody, all of us have layer and layer and layer and layer of unconscious identification and patterns of action that start from those. And there's no hope for us as a species until we decide to uncover those. I don't think technology will ever save us. Science is not going to save us because it's going to be put into the use of the fear-based, story-bound, identity-bound parts of our psyches. Then the same thing happens with politics. I mean, the electorate, we the ones that do the election, we elect someone we can identify with, and that person seduces us to identify with something, and round we go. But so there's no chance of true leadership at that level, except under very rare circumstances when the country's at war and someone like Roosevelt shows up and is a true leader.
Right.
You know?
What's an example of a personal story that got in your way that you were able to dissolve through doing work, meditation, therapy, whatever?
Well, there's so many. Let's start at recognizing the part of me that was a teacher. And then when I was functioning as a teacher, didn't recognize that some of my way of relating was being controlled by a kind of ego dynamic I'll call the I know better, the know-it-all. You know? And so I would be defensive of, you know, I'd be identified with my ideas. I once had a tremendous, miserable argument. It was the last one I ever had with my mother. When I was in my early 50s, and so I've already been on a journey a long time in the path of consciousness, and we're arguing, we're fighting, because, you know, mothers trigger patterns from very early. But I was so angry, I walked off into a bedroom, sat down quietly by myself, and I just dove into this, you know, the seething feeling, emotional stuff, and I suddenly had the clear insight: I'm identified with my ideas, you know, and she's identified with hers. And all this lifetime, I've wanted her to respect my ideas and believe in my, you know, get my mom's approval of my mind and my thinking. And she had her own, and she was a very opinionated woman, but so was I, but I didn't see it. Mm. And so that was the last time in my life that I ever had an argument or even became upset when someone had a different point of view.
Does medical school, you know, there's people say it teaches physician attitude, you know, I'm the guy in the white coat that you should listen to, and I'm the authority. Does that must create stories going to med school like you have?
Well, when I went to med school, I remember the very first introductory class by one of the head faculty people who likened us to an elite like racehorses. That we were going to be the carriers of this great knowledge. And I remember that. I really remember that. I hope, you know, that was I went to medical school I graduated in 72. That was 1968. The Vietnam War was raging. I went to medical school largely because I didn't want to be, you know, inducted into the war. I also went to medical school because my mother was a nurse, and it was, you know, the way, you know, the way to outdo my dad, who was a school teacher, and also, you know, gain my mother's love subconsciously, unconsciously, you know, to outdo my dad, you know, win my mom, and also and avoid a war. Good reasons.
Very Oedipal and very productive.
Sure, but the point is, I don't know where we are now. I run into the situation that the way again and again and again of doctors who are too rushed with their patients. Too many of my friends have been misdiagnosed. I haven't practiced medicine for years, and frequently I catch it right away. You know, just in a conversation, or I recognize how could they have made that mistake? So I think we always were teaching it from the left brain, but some of the doctors that were semi-retired and instructing me had practiced long enough to really look at medicine through their hearts and in a different way. Now I think we were almost manufacturing doctors. And I wish it weren't so. I know the amount to which young physicians know about nutrition is very, very little. They're still talking about, oh, you're on chemotherapy. You really need to have a lot of good protein, so eat lots of red meat. And of course, red meat is a class A carcinogen, well, processed red meat.
And acidic.
Well, it's the same, processed red meat like sausages and bologna and hot dogs. They're the same category as cigarette smoking.
Yeah.
But any animal protein is carcinogenic to humans as soon as you go past a very modest amount. So here we are having doctors where the science of the relationship between heart disease and cancer and consumption of animal protein is well documented, but it hasn't crossed over into the oncologists who are telling people, here I am treating you for cancer, and by the way, go home and eat a diet that's going to create inflammation and acidic environment in the body and be supportive of cancer. I mean, it's not that eating too much animal protein causes cancer, it's just a correlation, but it's a statistically documented, again and again, correlation. So is it true? Probably. Is it absolutely true? No. We'll never know. We don't know this. There's no proof that we don't know how cigarettes cause cancer. We just know there's a correlation, a very strong correlation. So, and I think the most important thing is doubt. I mean, if you're a good scientist, you have to have an open mind. You have to know that you may be resting your identity on things your identity does not need to rest on. You may be a champion of your ideas to the point of not being able to take on other people's ideas. And that's what happens in politics. If we had all these people that were arguing, deciding who has the best idea here, and let's incorporate that, and who has the best idea here, we'd be in a different system. And instead we're in this incredibly polarized partisan system. And at the level that we're currently at, there's no way out of it. You can't elect yourself out of it. There's no election that's going to save us, and no candidate.
What is going to save us?
Nothing but education of the nature of the mind, and not the nature of the mind as is being studied in science alone. It's really helpful now what we know about left brain and right brain because of split brain patients, where they cut the
corpus callosum.
Yes, the corpus callosum, and now you have a patient. We do that for epilepsy, for rare forms of severe epilepsy. But we now have a whole bunch of patients that have survived that kind of surgery starting in the 1980s. And we know that we now can actually see how the left brain functions independently of the right brain and vice versa. And that level of science is helpful to us. Trying to figure out what the amygdala does is interesting. Thinking you can find a drug that can then subdue what goes on in the amygdala, maybe cause some sort of emotional rebalancing in people or help them get over trauma more quickly. I think that's going to be, there are much, much more practical and effective ways, starting with meditation and mindfulness and contemplation, self-observation. Yeah, so the answer to the question is the only thing that will help us is raising consciousness, which means education itself has to be shifting from science, math, survival-oriented. Those are survival-oriented education systems because science and math gives us tremendous power to manipulate the external environment without actually understanding it. So, that is understanding it with the heart, understanding it with the body, feeling like I'm a human being interconnected with all of life. I'm an earthling on a planet interconnected with all of life and everyone. Knowing that to be the fundamental truth. Now, what technologies do I want to apply?
It seems like Hinduism and Buddhism, I don't know, Taoism, they've understood what you're saying for millennia. So the understanding is out there. It just hasn't percolated really into the West.
I think it's not. I think you're right. I think the Hindus and the Buddhists would say ultimately that 95% of our intelligence is the body, the right brain, and the heart. They wouldn't have known to think about the right brain, but they would have said the heart, again, is a metaphor, and that 5% is the rational mind. But we now emphasize the rational mind in education and in every other thing, and the more the computer devices are used, the more the left brain and rational mind is being used. We're creating a kind of digital autism in so many young people.
Wow.
Because they're actually not relating. They're relating through emojis, and they're typing out a few words. They don't know what a person's voice tone sounds like that's upset or happy. They don't know what the expression on the face is of a person that's confused versus angry, or confused versus afraid. And we're seeing 16-year-olds are socially inept, completely socially inept, that have been functioning, with tweets and texting.
And video games.
But not actually socially engaging each other.
Except in the group video games, which isn't socially engaging, really.
Right, and then you're not actually seeing human expressions.
No. Have you met young people like that personally, that are so disassociated?
No, I yes, to some extent. I mean, I can see it. I can see it in my wife's. I better be careful. I can see it in some of the grandchildren and children of couples that are, that are in their 40s, in their children, or the grandchildren of certain couples, and a lot of the people that I hang around with don't give their children computer screens or very early. Steve Jobs would not give an iPhone to his children or an iPad. Steve Jobs sold them, but he wouldn't let his own children use them because he understood the danger of them. However, when you hear someone like Milton Friedman with a Nobel Prize in economics in the 70s saying that the purpose of this quote, purpose of a corporation is to maximize short-term benefits for investors. So then Monsanto can go and market a drug that is creating autism or accelerating autism in people. I'm talking about glyphosate that's in Roundup. And more, again, by correlation, we're seeing that. But the purpose of a corporation is to maximize short-term gains for shareholders. That's crazy. But now you can build a marketing system around that. You can build a financial structure around that, a business plan around that.
We have.
So what I'm saying is the left brain can start from an assumption that's not true. His definition of a corporation isn't true. It's just a definition. It would be like saying the purpose of Richard Moss is to make life really good for him and the few people he cares about at the expense of everyone else, because that doesn't matter.
Right.
And would that be truth? Well, if you say that self-interest is fundamental truth, self-interest plus fear is Donald Trump personified and multiplied by billions. Yeah. Self-interest plus fear. And so, if we're going to heal any of this, we not only have to know science, but we have to know psychology, but we mostly have to know ourselves through meditation and contemplation. Self-reflection.
Going back to research, it seems to me one of the most important phenomena is the placebo effect, that 40% or more of drug trials, placebo is effective or more so than the pharmaceutical. But that hasn't been explored very much, but that seems to be so important. Why hasn't medicine really delved into that?
Well, I think what you're saying about the power of the placebo effect, I don't think we fully know that. We know as much about that as we could, but I do think that there is a deep understanding in science of the placebo effect and in psychopharmacology and pharmacology in general of the placebo effect. The thing is that if you can show a small percentage of improvement, even a 3% improvement, taking a chemotherapy over taking a placebo, people will take it despite the side effects. On the other hand, if you were to have people singing, learn to write poetry, singing, going on a whole food plant-based diet, you would be beating out every form of chemotherapy agent. You would be Or if you combine just, there was a paper presented that I haven't personally seen. It was just told to me, but it was at a functional medicine conference back in October. No, let's see, maybe last spring. That my MD friend of mine told me about, and it basically it had people with the same diagnosis of cancer and the same chemotherapy regimen. One group did the chemotherapy regimen, and the other group did that, plus had a worked with singing, music, and they had a 70% longer remission rate.
Interesting.
So that's fascinating. And all the spiritual traditions have chanting,
Yeah,
and music, and almost all the stories of love and all of our deep values. We hear them all day long. Music, whether it's country western, which is one style, or whether it's western, which is another style, or whether it's east west coast, and who knows. There are all these different musical styles, but we're still telling the story of pain and suffering and change and overcoming and loving, and it touches people.
Mm-hmm.
The thing about, to me, if someone goes to Bible school, at the end of going to Bible school, they should have learned to write their own Bible.
What do you mean?
Well, there's a line in Walt Whitman's poems, one of his poems called Passage to India, where he says, "Passage to the land of budding Bibles," meaning every one of us is a spiritual wealth and a spiritual source. And the Bible you read and study with your left brain, unless you transform that into your heart and let your body become a servant of the deepest values you learn from that, the Bible becomes a weapon in support of various belief systems. But if you're really going to study the Bible, you're studying, in essence, the ability to write your own scripture, to become a living scripture. So for me, if I could change all the Bible schools around, you'd go in and you'd come out, and at the end of it, you would have found your connection to deep values. You would have struggled with your process of transformation and change through hardship often, through suffering often, through the blessedness of knowing some people who are really more evolved than you, and through the transmission from their hearts and beings, through their energy, direct transmission, and you start to write the story of who you are. You write your own deep spiritual truth. And that sense, to me, otherwise you're just simply educating the left brain on something that has nothing to do with the left brain.
What spiritual background, what were you raised with when you were a boy?
Well, almost nothing. My parents were Reformed Jews, and I never went to temple ever until I had to get bar mitzvahed, and then I had to memorize a small chunk of Hebrew and recite it, and that took going to classes after school twice a week or once a week, I can't remember, for like a year, and I didn't want to go. So I would say, the deepest religion in my family household was just how you cared for everybody else. And of course, there are the cultural. So I didn't have much spiritual inculcation whatsoever through religion in my development, in my childhood, in my youth.
Where and when were you born?
Oh, I was born in the East Coast in New York City in 1947.
What month?
January.
So are you Aquarian?
No, I'm quite thoroughly
a Capricorn?
Capricorn.
Capricorn.
I don't follow much. I have almost no sense of astrology, me personally. But I have respect for people who can use it as a window, a good window into patterns and ways of looking wisely at people's lives and choices.
Yeah, I think it can be a map of what we want, what our strengths and weaknesses are, and what we want. It's kind of a map of karma in a way, so we can be aware. Oh, this is what I'm focusing on this lifetime. What led you to med school besides the draft?
I think I told you. Well, actually, the real reason when I was young, I was my mother didn't breastfeed for very long, about maybe day 5 or 6, as I've heard the story, because she was too shy to be in public breastfeeding. She would always have to go back upstairs, and it was a 5-story walk up in Lower Manhattan, and so I went on whatever it is, the baby food, man-made
Formula.
stuff. And I became severely allergic to it. And then
Ooh.
from that point on, allergic to just about everything, and
Ooh.
asthmatic and celiac. And so I was a very unhappy baby and a happy body. But one of the great events of my life, and that I can remember back to maybe 4 years old, was going to the doctor with my mother. So long story short, the guy in the white coat was with my mother in her dressed nicely with perfume and speaking very respectfully. He had power. My dad was gone all day long going to school. So lo and behold, 20 years later, I find myself a doctor, right? How did that happen?
Oh, that's great. What was your specialty? What kind of physician did you
Well,
become?
I was in so many ways psychologically ambivalent about medicine that I didn't start committing my heart to it till kind of later. So initially, I thought I was going to do psychiatry, and I started a psychiatric residency. But I was in the San Francisco Bay Area, and someone had introduced me to rock climbing, and I became a passionate rock climber. And I was sitting early on in my psych residency, and I was listening to this stuff, and I went, God, I'm so tired of being inside of an intellectual context. And it was the point where I realized that this living your life through the mind is interesting, but experiencing life directly is so much more wonderful. And I was experiencing life in a way I'd never experienced before in rock climbing. I had been athletic. I had surfed as a kid. I was a lifeguard and was at the beach. So I was an intermediate surfer. And I loved that experience, but it wasn't something you could do as regularly unless you became a passionate surfer and followed the waves and
Right.
moved to a climate where you could do it all the time.
Right.
I didn't. But there I was finishing my internship, having a day off, and there was a place you could go not far away to do a little bouldering, and I just became just so captured by it. So Yosemite's being 4 hours away from San Francisco, right? I started, and that's when I decided to leave the residency and join an emergency room group and become an ER doc. And in the early 70s, that was incredibly fun because you could get up in the morning. I did. I got up early every morning I'd work 3 or 4 days a week. I'd get up on those mornings and I'd go and scrub with the neurosurgeon. I'd scrub with the orthopedic surgeon. I'd scrub with the hand surgeon. And I'd learn and learn and learn everything I needed for trauma medicine firsthand before there were any residencies for it. And I loved it. That's what I loved. Because again, it was so experiential. You actually did something and got a result.
Yeah.
And then then the changes started happening to my life in my late 20s. And I'd already been in a kind of spiritual seeking process. So one day I was finished with medicine.
And then how did you make a living?
Well, I was finished in the sense that doors had opened inside my consciousness, and suddenly I had a profound experience of realization. In fact, I didn't know those experiences existed, really. But you call it in what you wrote to me, downloads. I had a massive download of a basic shift in the structure of consciousness. And how I made a living was that when you're on such a journey and you're seeking in some way, you're basically led synchronistically from one thing to another. And I met a doctor who had left medicine and was exploring consciousness. His name was William Brew Joy. I was introduced to the Los Angeles Center for the Healing Arts also around the mid-70s, and I'd been part of a spiritual group in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, for a number of years before that. What happened is I basically came out the other side. I left medicine, I got up in the morning very early. I meditated and read, went for walks, and I didn't know what was next in my life. And my old patients that had found me in the clinic and in the ER, some of them would track me down because they'd go in and they said, well, what happened to Dr. Moss? And then one of the nurses would say, well, he's trying to make up his mind whether he wants to stay in medicine. And they would phone me and I would see them. And so they'd come to my house and all I'd do is just sit down with them and hold their hands in silence for 30 minutes and feel the energy flowing through us and then listen to them. And one day I got a phone call from a therapist who said, you've been seeing one of my clients and they're making incredible progress. What are you doing?
Holding their hand.
Yeah, exactly. Holding their hands, feeling the energy streaming through us. And anyway, that person said, well, would you do a training for some of my colleagues? And I said, no, I don't know what I'm doing yet. And again, about 8 months later, she contacted me again. And again, it was because synchronistically, I was working with one of her clients. And in this case, an enormous ovarian mass, which was there before she came to visit me and sat there holding hands, and which drained spontaneously, if I use medical language, and disappeared just before she was about to go in and have surgery. So that also, that also was a client of the same therapist. And now there was a physical healing of some kind, and which I attributed it to when people shift states, they also shift bodies, and if you shift bodies, things can change.
And dissociative identity disorder teaches us that, because each alter has completely different physiology.
Exactly. Which, of course, none of us knew back in the mid-'70s. But when she finally asked me a second time whether I would do something for colleagues, that was the first group I ever did. And after that, I began to model group work after the doctor that I had met in Southern California and done some retreat work with.
Dr. Joy?
Yeah, Dr. Joy.
And were these your first workshops in Colorado or California?
No, California. I didn't move to Colorado until 2012.
So this was in Los Angeles?
This was in San Francisco Bay Area, starting in end of 1976. I was 4 years still practicing medicine at that point. I was 29 years old.
And what could you say more about your mystical experience, the download? What happened? What did you receive?
Well, there's been quite a few of them. In those initial years in particular, it's not just a question of what I received, it's something fundamental changed, but it was terrifying.
Oh.
It was like being annihilated. It was like I thought I was losing my mind. It was very good that I'd been a doctor because I could say, wait a minute, this doesn't match any definition of psychosis. This is more than an anxiety attack. This is not pheochromocytoma, an adrenaline-secreting tumor of the adrenal glands. This isn't any form of epilepsy. There's no way to know what this is through a medical model. And I knew enough to be able to say that to myself. And so then I started just asking, well, who's taken this journey? And here I'm raised non-religiously but Jewish. And I had read the gospel maybe 4 months before or less, 2 months before. And I remember crying reading it the first time in my life. I read the basic gospels.
John and Mark and Luke.
Yes. And when I asked the question, who understood this and has been here before, the answer was Jesus. And then I said, oh, I didn't want to become a Christian. I said, it wouldn't have ever occurred to me. What I said was, then whatever that is meant by Christ consciousness is what I have to understand. And then all I did was sit there and do the only thing I knew how to do, which was to report to myself what my experience was. So I'd say, now my mind is in the future and I'm becoming terrified, thinking I'm losing my mind, there won't never be a function. Now my mind is in the past, remembering how I was and therefore evaluating how I am. in a very dark way. Now I'm breathing. Now I'm feeling the sensations of the chair. Now I'm feeling the breeze. Now I'm seeing the shadow changing the light in the room, shadow of a cloud. Now I'm here, and around the clock for a couple of days. And that was how I just kept myself in the present moment by self-observation. And no one taught me to do this. It was spontaneous. I don't know why I knew to do that. But I did, and I didn't associate that in any way with discovering what Christ consciousness was. But I've written a book called The Black Butterfly. I was sitting in a friend's backyard who was happily taking care of me because I needed to be taken care of, at least in a place to stay. And she was a Jungian analyst, and she knew that this was a spiritual experience of some kind that was unfolding. And as I was sitting in her backyard, some butterflies were dancing in the air. One was dark and one was light. And they mated on a branch just a meter from me. And then when they were done mating, they danced away, and the black butterfly landed right in the center of my forehead.
Oh, that's great.
And in that moment, everything changed. Everything changed. And it changed forever. It's not that I stay in that state, which was extraordinary sense of oneness, fundamental understanding of the oneness of all existence, and that it was all love.
And that's Christ consciousness.
That's what I associate to Christ consciousness. And when you read something like the Thomas Gospel, and Jesus says, "A man old in years shall take lesson from a child of 7 days, and that he shall know the kingdom." Or when the statement, "Except as you be as a little child, you can't know the kingdom." Or other parts of the Thomas Gospel that are similar to, but are mystically more pure, less edited, because it was buried for so long and then dug up. For 1,500 years it was buried and unedited. And so it is for me the premier spiritual scripture that I have studied, but I've studied many at this point thoroughly. Because it's been 42 years since that event with the black butterfly. But it changed me, and it changed in the way I worked, and people started coming to me very spontaneously. So how I earned a living happened without me even trying. And
mystics often have that dark night of the soul where everything kind of collapses, so it can be put together in a new way. So
yes.
It sounds like a mystical experience that you underwent.
That's what I call it, a mystical experience.
Yeah.
Experience of fundamental realization. And it was terrifying before, it was wondrous during, and it was incredibly dislocating to build a life once that change had happened. And I was only 30 years old.
And you had to change all your stories, just about.
They started changing. Basically what happened is that I would say the assemblage point where my consciousness went from Richard Moss, the ego, me, the sense of me, I, it went to awareness. The assemblage point became awareness. And so when you take awareness and you look at a belief about yourself, it's different than being identified with the belief. If you take awareness and you look at a feeling, it's different than being lost in the feeling. You feel it, but you're also aware of it. And in that relationship that awareness is with thinking and sensation and feeling, we're back to Buddhism. As far as the Buddha's great insight was, for a human being, consciousness is experienced as sensation before anything else. And so stay in the body, stay deep enough in the body. And that's what I did with my inquiry. By watching where my mind went, I kept coming back to the present moment in my body. And then nobody can explain why a butterfly will land on your forehead and shift you.
Synchronicity.
Sure. But the point is, this happens. This is real in the world. And spiritual change, spiritual awakening that way. And then what people do with it is really up to them. And it takes an enormous courage, ambition, to follow a mystical experience and let it guide your life and be changed by, not just by it, but by how it's changed my way of relating to myself first, fundamentally, and to everyone and everything else simultaneously.
Would you say that mindfulness, meditation, John Kabat-Zinn, is kind of like a contemporary version of what you invented in your process?
Um, I think mindfulness meditation is basically a very ancient practice that's been beautifully reframed for contemporary time by John Kabat-Zinn, and it is at least giving people an opportunity to observe their minds and to become and to start to cultivate the aware self, and through that, it's being primarily marketed as stress reduction. And the simple truth is, and John Kabat-Zinn himself said this, mindfulness can make you a better assassin. So it's mindfulness. For me, mindfulness practice has to be consecrated to something. And for me, my experience was that the very fabric of this universe is love, the very substance of this universe, and the root, consciousness itself, is love. And so mindfulness in service to love is extremely helpful. Mindfulness in service to just stress reduction will make you a better assassin. You're going to shoot the gun better if you're less stressed. And
less shaky.
Yeah. And you can teach mindfulness, and they do teach mindfulness practices to elite soldiers. And we teach it to Olympic athletes, and now we can teach it to business people. But ultimately, mindfulness in service to what? That's the most fundamental, essential thing. Because if it's in service to me functioning better in the world to get ahead and make more money, mindfulness isn't going to do us a bit of good. In fact, mindfulness, ultimately, if practiced, is going to cause you to digest yourself, to lose interest in certain levels of yourself, and it will be transformative. But in the superficial way in which it's introduced into the culture right now, it's being co-opted by how to become more efficient or how to work better or how to diminish stress. Mindfulness is ultimately a path to no story.
Got it. Would you say that the time of your downloading or your mystical experience was one of the most difficult times, or what would have been the most difficult times of your life, and how have you coped with them?
In an existential sense, in terms of the sheer degree of anxiety and fear that I felt in the week or so preceding, when this energy exploded in me, but it hadn't resolved itself into, even briefly, the black butterfly experience, that was terrifying. It was an existential crisis, a dark night, a kind of sense of being annihilated. And then afterwards, to the extent that my ego took over, again, left brain took over because my mind was so strong. Then I would once again be in an interior conflict between this awakening energy and my old psychology. And so it was in the battle between this awakening awareness and my old psychology that was the transformational process. And so there wasn't one dark night. In terms of my own, I would say, areas where my soul has had to do the deepest work, it had to learn to feel safe in this body after an infancy without being safe, in a childhood where I was rushed to the hospital, almost not breathing multiple times in my life, and was asthmatic until puberty, severely asthmatic, and I was getting injections. So if you don't have if you don't have a ground of safety in your own body, then fear or insecurity, not insecurity in the psychological sense, I compensated well for that with my intellect and my natural athleticism and things. But I would say that the greatest teacher in my life that caused me the most despair was always in relationships. It was the relationship where I was abandoned or the relationship where I was the abandoner. It was in the long marriage that wasn't alive anymore, and the struggles to break free of it, and times where I broke the rules and had to fess up, and so for me, and I'm 71 now, I would say the spiritual awakening shifted the assemblage point from ego to awareness, and that was an ongoing and profound and continuous work. And in the end, always to learn finally to love with others. And so the struggle of love, romantic love, and attachment, and abandonment and betrayal, those were the deep themes that produced crises of misery in my life.
How has it played out in your current marriage?
Well, she went through her miseries too and arrived at the same ground, that the only reason to be here ultimately is to love. So when our paths finally crossed, which is a fun story but not appropriate for now.
Oh, come on. Gotta hear it.
So, love is transactional. I'll love you if you love me. I'll love you if you appreciate me. Once love is no longer transactional, then it's not about loving her, it's about loving love with her. And that's a very different path. And it's not about, I'll love you if you love me back. I'll love you if you make me feel safe. It's, I'm going to love with you regardless of what you do. And she made the same choice. And so our relationship is exquisite and beautiful. And the consciousness that's growing in our relationship is actually affecting how I teach and what I do. And we've begun to teach together. And so her path was different than mine. She had 3 children and raised 3 other stepchildren through the course of 2 marriages. I had 2 marriages. And she had started her career out in business. Well, she started out just getting a job on an assembly line and pretty soon became a factory manager and then pretty soon became an executive. And then she became a mom and everything changed. But her path has been shamanic and Buddhism primarily, and the Diamond Logos work. Her teacher lives in the Bay Area, her principal teacher.
And did you have children along the way?
I have never had children of my own. In my second marriage, my first marriage, we wanted children and never had them. I didn't really want children, but we never prevented it from happening. I was too self-involved to want children. But in my second marriage, I had 3 stepchildren that came into my life at the ages of 6, 11, and just turning 14. 11 turning 12 and 13 turning 14.
That's intense.
Yes. And I'm very, very close to the youngest, who's now 37. The other 2, the older ones, when I separated from their mother, they kind of lived in her story. And I haven't had much contact with them now since 2010. But the thing about all of us is, whatever awakens in us, we're still human beings. And the most beautiful thing is to go into profound intimacy with life. And of course, I started that with rock climbing in a way. Just this. There are people who just need to experience, and those are the ones that maybe you could say compulsively climb or compulsively push the edges in extreme sports primarily, or in athletics. And I'm not talking about addictions, because these are very thoughtful addictions. But once you truly know no other deeper form of aliveness, then I remember when one of the astronauts, his name is eluding me now, said to me, we were in a program together, we were contributing, and said, Richard, what you're teaching is really what we need, but until you can make experiences that are more exciting than flying a jet plane, the men I know aren't going to keep it up. It's the sheer aliveness of that part of life for people in the military.
The intensity.
Or the astronauts. Yes, it's aliveness. We all are seeking aliveness, one way or another. And unfortunately, it tends to become the aliveness of anger, the aliveness of emotional reaction, the aliveness of dominance or victimhood or perpetrator, instead of the aliveness of dancing, the aliveness of painting, the aliveness of poetry. I think there's an aliveness in using your mind to write new algorithms too. But it's not the same kind of aliveness. It'll never teach you what your body and your heart knows.
Mm.
And then ultimately, the deepest of all, I think, forms of aliveness is intimacy between two people. And it's the most wonderful thing, and I think the thing most of us are the most afraid of and confused about.
Because you could be overwhelmed or taken over.
But you have to go back into the scars and the scar tissue from your early life and your early family of origin things. Even when you had good parents, nobody could mirror you adequately enough that you would feel really seen. You have to see yourself ultimately. All of us, and even with good parents, they still lived inside their own stories. Nobody's born Jewish or Muslim or Buddhist or Christian. That's enculturation, and that enculturation fits some and doesn't fit others. So that enculturation. I mean, if you're going to get to the root of Christian faith or the root of monotheism isn't about one God. It's about an idea that makes every other form of truth relative.
That's interesting.
So, otherwise, it would be insane. You think that the root of monotheism is believing in one God or understanding that consciousness is, in fact, prior to everything you're conscious of. The only one God ultimately. Gods are wonderful ways of looking at dynamics, human dynamics, archetypal dynamics, even dynamics in nature in many, many ways. But what part of you can then look at those dynamics is conscious. And if you can look even deeper and deeper, you come to this fundamental realization of consciousness, as deep as anyone can experience it through meditation or spontaneous awakening. And there's no way to take a measure and know who's experienced it more or less deeply. You kind of look at what their life leaves behind. Because once you had that deep awakening into consciousness, there's a transmission that never stops. Mm. It's never stopped with me. I'm still transmitting. I'm still affecting people in a way they don't understand just by being around me. But my own seeking has been to love with someone ultimately, and to know that I don't know what love is, and I'm not even going to bother spending time, trying to define love.
Just do it.
We do know at some deep level. Our bodies know, our hearts know. Our left brain does not. It cannot.
Eric Fromm said it's deep caring.
That's one profound aspect of it for sure. But it's caring deeply enough to set aside our own individualistic behavior. Or it's caring. In front of love, the two things that I know in myself block love are whatever I do to close my heart, and whatever closes my heart is done because of some form of self-involvement, some form of self-importance, some self-justification. And if self-importance, self-involvement, self-justification, my agenda gets between me and love, then that agenda goes, that identification goes, that self-involvement goes. And what's left is the immediacy of relationship right now. And that slow digestion, that slow undressing of layer and layer and layer of self-involvement is both the most wonderful journey of all and at times very, very challenging. People...
Go ahead.
We come into this world and we have to separate. We come in fused with our mother. We evolved inside of her energy field. We come in a state of oneness with everything, but we don't know it. We have to separate from her. We have to separate from the world we're immersed in. But once we've separated, we're in exile and we start to suffer and we live out of our left brain and our rules and our stories and our beliefs. And they go on for millennia. Some of them are profoundly deep that we don't even realize we're caught in them, like the patriarchal belief systems and how that's affected male and female relationships for millennia. But to realize that there is a necessity to separate, and then when you get into a deep relationship, one part of you is called to get closer and closer, and another part of you is still struggling to separate. And comes this profound yes-no in the lives of every human being that wants to love another and be loved by another. And that's a worthy path of human beings, to learn to love and be loved. And to struggle
that
to
tension,
separate.
that tension creates a nice sexual chemistry sometime. That kind
Oh,
of little
yes,
tension.
beautiful sexual chemistry. As long as both people are going deeper and deeper into source, they're going to meet, not just making love is more than.
Oh, wow. Richard.
Just died completely, the battery. So I called you back on the phone.
Okay.
What I said was making love is much more than sex. And sex is an extraordinarily beautiful part of making love. But I'm 71. Sex is different now than when I was 61, 51, 41, 31, you know. And some of my friends and one of my really important mentors in the relationship domain, he's 87. His wife died 4 years ago. They had a very deep, deep path of making love and intimacy and love making and sexual love making into their 80s.
Yes.
And it's this is a very good reason to be alive. But even more powerful is you can't do that as two individuals in an individualistic sense. You have to have, it has to be two people that are deeply surrendered to the consciousness of the relationship itself. And then lovemaking is what that consciousness wants, and sensual, erotic, erotic, physical intimacy is a piece of that, exquisite, beautiful piece of that. And to me, this is where we really heal ourselves. I mean, a friend of mine died recently, and his wife said, 2 days before they died, he was 76 and she's 11 years younger. They were making love, and then they looked at each other. I say friend, they were students of mine for decades, and they were also dear friends. And they looked at each other and said, "Aren't we lucky?"
That's great.
And and they have a school of consciousness in South America that influenced many, many people beautifully. But to keep taking that journey into intimacy more and more profoundly, into solitude more and more profoundly, and meeting in the depths of solitude and in the depths of vulnerability and openness. To me, this is the profound richness of life.
Let's talk about your specific use of the mandala when you're doing sessions with clients. The focus is on being aware in the now. How would you explain what your approach is?
Yeah, the mandala model basically is a kind of way of explaining a lot. It basically says that the only thing that we know for sure is that it's now. And that when the thinking mind, the rational mind leads us away, it will take us into time, or in fact it creates time, and it will take us into subject-object consciousness. It will take us into what the baby doesn't have. So the mandala basically says the 4 ways we lose contact with the immediacy of ourselves in our bodies in the present moment is when the mind goes into identification with stories about ourselves, what I call me stories, or it goes into the same kind of identification, judgments fundamentally of others, the you stories, and that can also be of money and God and not only just people. If you can name it, you can have a story about it. Or it goes into time, it's in the past, it digs deep down into the ground of memory, and it uses the memory, which it selects, which is selectively selected. So from the past, we justify the reaction of the present. And based on the past, we anticipate the future. So the mandala basically says there's only now, there's 4 ways we leave: beliefs, stories, judgments about ourselves, others, past, and future. And that you had to create an ego, so it's a miracle in itself. And that the journey is to come back to embodiment in the present moment, liberating yourself from time. The body doesn't know it gets older, just the mind says that. There's nothing about the future that's scary except the thought you tell yourself about it today. And so hope and fear co-create each other about the future. And so the mandala is a way of helping people. It's a way of helping me listen to what people are doing with their thoughts and what they're saying. It makes it very, very simple if you realize that there's only now. I mean, your consciousness gives you a chance to have a relationship to your beliefs about yourself. Those are stories about yourself. I'm not good enough, or I'm better than you, or beliefs about others. You know, I can't live without you. Beliefs about money. You know. And how we select from the past to justify our our present moment reaction. How we anticipate the future based on what we select from the past. And if you understand this and you practice it, you begin to live not in the rational mind, you live from your heart. And your heart begins to lead the rational mind. And it's an evolutionary shift that is incredibly profound, this movement into heart mind. Because most people, for example, you can't have an emotional reaction like anger without telling yourself a story, or resentment or bitterness. They're generated by thinking. Envy, jealousy, generated by thinking. And so first you have to be able to see the thought, see what the thought creates in you, and step away from it. That's fundamental work. And then feeling is a different mode of consciousness entirely. So we have to look at what kinds of our ability to journey with our feelings in generative ways, in evolutionary ways, as opposed to blame someone for what we feel. And that's a highly simplified version of it, but once I understood that, it became the central model for how I live and teach.
So how have your books evolved? The I That Is We, Awakening to Higher Energies Through Unconditional Love, that was your first book? And what was the message there in a nutshell?
Yeah, the message there was profound change happens through a mysterious process. Here's what happened to me, and this is what it's led to me to understand. So it wasn't that it was an autobiographical book, it was the beginning of writing from a new consciousness. And then every other book is just my next iteration of understanding that consciousness or how to share it. And so the books have evolved until I'd say the Mandala of Beings and the one following it, the last one, Inside Out Healing, basically are a mindfulness model. A very practical way of grounding the spiritual journey, without having to have any kind of belief systems. It's all just basically observation and practice.
So would you say the key steps that you teach to evolve are to use meditation and maybe physical exercise like yoga to remind us to stay in the present so that we're centered?
Yeah, that's well put. I would say that we have to learn that basically the heart as a metaphor, and the right brain and the body speak one language, and that's 95% of our intelligence. And then we need to learn to see what our thinking mind has done to us and is doing to us that is both good and horrible. This learning process is, it can't be exported easily to public education or university education, conventional education. It's far, far more experiential. You have to learn it with your body.
How do you learn it with your body?
Well, it's processes on my retreats that move back and forth between dancing, whirling, breathing, meditation, contemplation, self-reflection, dream work, more dancing, different forms of music, working with music in different ways, chanting, using the voice. And what happens is that the person starts to anchor more and more in their body in the present moment. That changes the consciousness and their perception of themselves and the world around them in mystical ways. That is what we would call mystical, but to me are really totally natural. It also unifies that group of people. They start to connect to each other in ways that give me profound hope for what's possible in human community. But you couldn't do that sitting at desks in a school setting. And so this kind of education of the heart mind, or transformational education, it's happened forever. I mean, the Buddha did it his way, and the disciples of the Buddha do it their way, and the Taoists,
Sufis world,
and the Sufis world, the Mevlevi dervishes world. They chant, they sing. My morning practice every day is first singing and chanting, improvisationally, or repeating melodies that I've made up, or using melodies that I like from classical music, and putting words to them, always merging words and music, words and sound.
Can you give us a little sample?
Well, years and years ago, I put the words "How I Love You" to the Paco Bell canon. And I say years ago, in some way back in the early, mid-70s probably, when I started just singing, "How I love you, how I love you, how I love you." But I could get up in the morning and sing that same melody and go, thank you, I'm so grateful, how I'm taken birth on this world. It's a mystery beyond imagining. I just sing until I feel it living me. This I do just about every day. And the words can come in a flow that often is just play. In the way it's happening now, it's a way of subtly feeling into what is right now, seeing it in new ways. And that's what I do.
It's spiritual rap.
Yep, spiritual rap, and sometimes really simple. And I put the word holy in front of anything. Holy feeling, holy breathing, holy fearing, holy wanting, holy lonely, holy dispirited, holy sorrow, holy grateful. And so everything that could possibly be felt becomes holy, because if I wasn't capable of inventing the most horrible things, that too is miraculous. If I were dead, I couldn't create anger. But to be identified with anger, that's stupidity.
I forgot to ask you this. Do you think that your original awakening was a Kundalini experience? Do you use that word?
Well, no. I mean, in terms of this gigantic energy that happened, I assume Kundalini would be one way to describe it. The notion that it would start from the bottom of the spine, or start in the big toe and go up one leg, and no, nothing like that. Nothing systematic like that. It was an explosion, literally. the world unraveled. Everything became vibration. And it was terrifying to me until the black butterfly landed on my forehead, and then it just went to love, perfection. And as I say, it was the beginning. I think the notion that we assemble ourselves, a baby has nothing to assemble around. And so if it were raised by wolves, of which we have one example, of a young French boy that was raised by wolves, he was never able to be socialized. So a baby is undifferentiated consciousness with an inclination to differentiate, and it differentiates if it were raised by baboons in one way. But if it's raised by people that are Orthodox Jews, that's going to be one way to raise it. If it's raised by people who are autistic, it's going to be another way. If you're raised by people that are in conflict and addicted to alcohol, and that's another context. But no matter how you're raised by people who already are differentiated into their stories and have in that way lost connection to their true sense of self. And so you have the best of parents who still are not yet awake to who they really are, raising their children, but giving them the capacity to become differentiated, to be separate in me. And then the rest of life is about getting back home, but consciously.
That's kind of the Adam and Eve story. You have to be expelled from the Garden of Eden to go back more conscious.
I agree with you. And to me, you could say the serpent is the Kundalini energy.
Yeah.
The serpent is that awakening energy.
Can you give an example from maybe something you included in an inside-out healing of a specific example? You gave us the tumor one. I think examples are interesting.
Yeah, it was. I don't know if I put it in the book. I think I may have. In inside-out healing, there was a woman who was struggling with tinnitus, and she was an author, a writer, and she couldn't write anymore. And she was just really beating herself up, not because of tinnitus, but because of the story she had about it. And when I had her in front of a group of people, and I said, okay, so what are your stories about tinnitus? Or what are your stories about you, because you have tinnitus? She said a few things, and suddenly she just stopped dead in her tracks, and she said, oh my God. It's all my mind. I can see now, it's all my mind. It's just a sound. It's just a sound. And from that day on, she resumed writing. Effectively.
Did the tinnitus change?
Nope. What healed was her reaction to the tinnitus. I got an email from a woman, it was 6 months ago now, who came to one of my retreats in Copenhagen. And it was a retreat in which I was teaching what we've been discussing. There's only now, the stories you tell yourself. And as I was taking people through that work, she had come because she was in postpartum depression. And she was suicidal, but she had 2 twin daughters. And nothing had worked. She tried medication, that didn't work. She tried many different forms of intervention. And she said in the email, she said, the only thing that had kept her alive was that she just couldn't imagine her little girls growing up and being told that when they were 4 months old, 5 months old, their mother killed herself. And as I was talking and as I was guiding this work, and she was sitting there, she said, suddenly the breeze came through the window and the hairs on my arm moved, and I was in the present, just like, and I realized suddenly that my depression, my postpartum depression, which is the medical stories, it's all about hormones and this and that, and changes in the brain due to hormones. And, she said, I realized it was stories, all stories. The story about who I was, the story of my identity, the story of even being a mother, that everything was story. And in that moment, it dropped away.
Wow.
And the postpartum depression simply ceased right then and there. And I didn't know this, Bishop Moss didn't know this, but she then came back for several other years to my workshops in Copenhagen, wanting to come up and just thank me. She said, but you were always pretty busy, and I didn't really want to draw attention. So she says this is like 8 years ago, and she was a scientist, and so she went home and integrated, raised her daughters, and she started teaching consciousness work with a scientific focus. And she said it was the best way I could thank you. So,
oh, that's touching.
yes, it is touching. And you see, I think when people are ready to receive this message, that there's the medical story and there's another story, which isn't to say discard the medical story.
No, it's like placebo.
It's like, and that there are different bodies at different vibrational levels, and the psychology of that body, or the psychology of that mind body, that mind heart, that mind body is different. And when it does shift, if it shifts profoundly, something else can enter and you start all over. And this is the story, I would think, of spiritual revelation. I know it comes like that. I don't know why or how, but I also know there's a transmission. The probability of that happening on your own is one thing. The probability of that happening around someone it's happened to is a lot higher.
Mm. How would you name those other energy bodies?
Oh, I just speak in metaphor. I don't name them.
You don't say 7 layers of the aura and etheric body and the emotional body and...
No, I don't. I've noticed that depending upon who the teacher is in the school, of healing and energy work and things, one chakra will be this color or that color, or it depends. To me, that's where we get into stories again. We create stories. I do know experientially that as we become more present, we change our body. We change our psyche, our psychology. We change our relationship to each other. We change our reactivity, our arousal level. Everything changes in a very positive way as we become more present and more embodied. And along the way, healing will happen. What you will also, you have to heal all the scars and scar tissue somehow before you can actually pass through the eye of the needle.
Mm.
But sometimes by grace we pass through the eye of the needle and then spend the rest of our lives digesting false identity and digesting the old scar tissue, and some of it comes from family of origin and some of it comes from the collective. So depending on the depth of your realization, you're healing and digesting and liberating yourself and everybody who comes near you, and in fact everybody. Because just like when I asked the question, who's been here, my answer was Jesus. From that moment onward, I knew that consciousness was available to me, that it was eternal. It's available to everyone. The consciousness that I experienced when I awakened is available to everyone. And even though I'm living in my body as this individual, and until you let go of your body, we're not going to know what comes next. But in this body, my body is being transubstantiated in love. It's wiser. It's more capable of delight. But I can't do what I used to do. I don't go rock climbing anymore.
Oh, nuts.
I don't, But so.
I bet you could surf.
Maybe. A friend took me as a gift for all the years I'd mentored him on a surf trip. And I went out and I caught a wave and I tore a muscle in my left hamstring.
Oh.
Just pulled a muscle badly enough that I couldn't surf anymore.
Oh.
So the answer is yes, I could surf, but I probably wasn't warmed up properly. I hadn't done that kind of movement before. And by the way, I don't want to at any point signal that I despair of, about medicine. I know there are more than one story. But for example, when I had spinal stenosis and I was in terrible pain and finally in wheelchairs, when I had back surgery for that a few years ago, it was an absolute liberation. I've never been in a wheelchair again.
What's spinal stenosis?
Yeah.
What is it?
It's a thickening of scar tissue and ligaments to stabilize the vertebrae because they're moving, they're too moving.
Oh.
And as those ligaments get thicker, they close in on the spinal cord and compress it.
Oh, ouch.
And ouch. And so that was able to be fixed surgically.
Yeah.
And it gave me a new life. It was exhausting, that level of pain.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's the form of medicine I'm just profoundly grateful for, and for the men and women who train themselves to do that with great skill and are dedicated to it. They're real human beings. My neurosurgeon literally cried on the couch cried on the couch in my room, in my recovery room, talking about one of his patients that he couldn't save, and who he had just met the husband of a year later after her death in the elevator, and the man, how are you, doctor, with such warmth. And he's been blaming himself for a year that he couldn't save her, knowing it was not to blame himself. And there comes the man who lost his wife, and he's just as kind as can be. And there's this neurosurgeon telling me that story, and tears are running down his face. And I thought, I picked a good doctor.
Yeah. Yes,
I picked a good doctor because I could feel him. You know, for me, you don't just go to find a doctor who's supposedly the best. You go to find a doctor that your heart responds to and is well trained. And by heart, I mean your body recognizes something about the humanity of this person that you're in resonance with.
You have a harmony. Yeah.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you if you're optimistic even in the face of, like, Brazil just elected an autocrat, and Trump and Putin and the guy in the Philippines and the Saudi prince, and we just hear story after story of this inequality increasing and ugliness. Do you have hope?
It hurts. I have hope that everything that I've just shared with you is real, is not fantasy. That you can transubstantiate your body in love, that you can learn to love and be loved in such profound ways, that you can do that kind of work and evolve yourself in consciousness here on planet Earth, having taken a human birth. I'm incredibly optimistic about the capacity for any individual to heal, and for communities of people to heal individuals within those communities and to heal each other once they understand more about awareness and consciousness and the relationship of that consciousness to themselves. But in terms of what's happening in our world now, with the intensification and the exaggeration of the left brain, and with media, it's not that the medium through which the left brain activation is shared, the computers, the computer screens, the TV screens, and then the biological breakthroughs. I'm not optimistic for us as a species in the future. I think we're going to end up with a very, very wealthy elite that use technology to protect themselves from environmental degradation, and the rest of humankind is going to be in desperate shape. And that we're not going to be able to stop that. We don't have the will to stop that, and we still believe in a savior, that we can elect some savior, and there isn't any. The only savior is each of us, and the more we can work together. So I'm quite pessimistic, really, about where we are now as human beings, and I consider it nonsense, the idea that we're going to go out into the solar system and create havens for human beings to live.
Yeah.
I mean, just the barrenness of Mars, the barrenness of the moon. Yeah, technologically we'll be able to create environments in which human beings can live, but there'll be no nature. It's only through a change of consciousness that we have any hope. And the work you have to do for that is profound and difficult, and we've just discussed it. And that is the profound healing. I I think we confuse ourselves and we lose the ear of many people that need to hear us when we start talking about different bodies and different chakras and different vibrations and this and that. Then we're in a different kind of esoteric place. That's to me, it's more practical. If you can take someone into an experience of a shift of consciousness, that they can understand how that actually took place and how they could make it happen for themselves, some people will follow it. I mean, Buddhism isn't based so much on belief systems as it is on practices. And yet some of the most heinous crimes in the last century took place among Buddhist culture.
Rohingya people, in Burma, Sri Lanka,
in Sri Lanka and other places. Yes. So religion itself is not; it's the practitioner. I mean, if you deeply you go to the source of Christian belief, it's about love and love of one another. That's what Paul says to Corinthians, and that's the most powerful commandment.
And yet, Northern Ireland, the Catholics and the Protestants fight each other. It's the Crusades. It's pretty...
Because there are many other competing stories. And because at the level of the ego, we're not actually conscious. We're robots. And we're obeying patterns of identification and self-identity that we inherited, that we were enculturated into, that aren't us. And until you can outgrow them, you don't have a chance of realizing your shared humanity is much, much deeper than whether you're Protestant or Catholic. And sadly, that's why I'm not optimistic. Every single person every child that's born is going to be inculcated into some dimension of identity, and then has been given the capacity to outgrow that through the miracle of consciousness, the miracle of an aware self, as opposed to, I mean, what we call artificial intelligence is a misnomer. It's artificial rationality. It's artificial intellect. Intelligence is a whole other thing. I mean, so we are going to be replacing human jobs with robots. We are going to be the victims of the successes of giant databases and more sophisticated algorithms. We're going to be able to heal the body in ways through genetics and other things in the coming decades, but it's only going to be available to the wealthy. And so we don't have a shared vision here on planet Earth any longer. And religion tried to give us that, but it was co-opted by the ego, and it became identity instead of path. So this is, for that reason, I'm not optimistic anymore.
Right.
I'm optimistic that you and I can come to the end of our life with a profound smile in our hearts, and every soul that we touch and is near us feels better about themselves, whether they understand why or not. Whether we can actually protect this planet from environmental breakdown and collectively.
Pleiadians, come on in, Pleiadians.
Oh, sure. I mean, well, that's another one. That's so maybe some super high species from a different, from out there in the universe will come in and save us from ourselves. I doubt it.
I doubt it. Because I think they're not supposed to intervene. So do you believe in reincarnation? When do you die, what happens? Anything?
I believe in transition. That is, I've had direct experience in a number of instances of being present for or accompanying people as they died, and have experienced amazing changes of energy and light, uplifting, remarkable energy changes. So there is a transition out of the body into consciousness, and of course, the Book of the Dead talks about the Bardo stages, and there are different versions of that in other traditions. What happens 4 or 5 days or a week after we die, I don't know. And do we reincarnate? I don't know, but certainly at a point where I should never have even had the thought, who's been here before, and had the answer, Jesus. You know, that life and what it realized and what it carried, which is why we still remember it, despite the crazy dogmas that have been built around it. It was accessible. It was available. In that sense, I think there is continuity of certain aspects of our lives. Whether actually I come back in again, I don't know. I don't remember ever having been here before, so I don't know.
Okay. What do you do for fun?
Well, just the relationship with Catherine, the way we lived and communicated is my greatest joy. I love to go for hikes with our dogs, or just the two of us. I read. I love to get up in the morning and sing. My practice is a joy for me. It's a passion. I know that it balances me so that I don't get too dispirited, depressed, or find myself succumbing to anger in the midst of the painful things that are happening all around us. I do understand why they're happening, and I think in a very profound and deep way. I also understand how difficult it is to change it. So what I do for fun is just love being embodied.
That's great. Do you have another book in you?
Yeah, it's coming.
What do you want to roughly? Where will it take you?
There's a whole series of short videos that I've made instead of writing, because I haven't wanted to write except poetry, which is part of my practice also. Not poetry to publish, just to keep surprising myself with shifting states through the use of words, as opposed to rationality, which just buries you in a state instead of shifting states. So there is a series of short talks I've given, any one of which could be part of a chapter, or pieces of a chapter. What I'm thinking of calling it, maybe the frontier of the heart. The heart is the new frontier, or maybe, I don't know, choosing love.
It'll evolve. It'll come to you.
Yeah. I mean, all the things we've been talking about today.
Yeah.
Or what would be in that book.
Cool. Do you have suggestions for visionary scientists who should be included in my book?
Oh.
Who would you like to read about?
If you can get a hold of this guy, Ian McGilchrist.
Don't know him.
The Master and His Emissaries. I've read it twice. The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World is the subtitle. The Master and His Emissary. The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World.
What's the theme?
So this book was the winner of the Scientific and Medical Network Book Prize in 2009, shortlisted for the Bristol Festival of Ideas Book Prize 2010, longlisted for the Royal Society Book Prize 2010. So he's a reader in history or literature, Western literature at Cambridge or Oxford, and he's also a neuroscientist.
Oh.
What's
one thing you learned that you hadn't thought about before from reading Ian's book?
A much deeper understanding of the relationship between left and right brain and how we assemble consciousness as we experience it. I'm not saying it's the source of consciousness, but without a brain, none of us are going to have any experience of consciousness as far as I know.
Is he a visionary?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Anybody else?
I can't really think of anyone.
Okay. All right.
I know that there's some wonderful people that from time to time you run into. Have you talked to the woman who wrote My Stroke of Insight?
No.
Jill Bolte Taylor.
Never heard of her. Great. My Stroke of Insight.
Yeah. And then the doctor, the neurosurgeon who
Oh,
had
Eben Alexander.
well, Eben Alexander, yeah.
He said yes. I talked to him. He's on.
Oh, good. So Jill Bolte-Taylor would be great.
Okay.
If Ian McGilchrist can talk to you, I'm sure you'll find him fascinating.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much.